Hello there. So I've had the Boox Note Air 3C from here on out, for almost 2 weeks now. And I've done a lot of videos on it. I've done a lot of interacting with the device. And I pretty much feel like my opinion on this device has kind of settled in. And it's time to do kind of a formal review. So we're going to go over all my pros and cons about this device now that I've had all this experience with it. Before I do that, however, I'm just going to tell you overall my impressions of the device. And I guess what I would say is that this is probably the best overall e-ink device on the market today. That would be my ultimate conclusion. But I want to say that with some notable caveats. So one caveat is this is not in any way a revolutionary device. This is not a device that does something really magical that we've never seen before. I mean, there's a couple interesting new features that Boox has added in their latest devices. So this, as well as the Ultra C Pro, and that will presumably be added into older devices. One would hope relatively soon. But outside of that, and those are nice, but I don't consider like huge things. Outside of that, this is an incremental device. This is a device that kind of reflects the learnings of the past that accumulates into this particular item, the 3C. And I think that's how we're going to look at the 3C. Going back like 5 years from now, I think that people will look back at this device and say, yeah, that was a really good device, but it's going to be part of the bigger picture of what came before and what comes after. It's not going to be the revolutionary type of device like, for example, say a Remarkable 2 that has this major impact and shifted the industry in a new direction. I don't think this device is that, and so don't expect that. So even though I call it the best all-around device, don't look for miracles from this device. It's just solid and really good at what it does and takes a lot of the best features that we've seen in e-ink devices and does the balance the best. And to that point, there are things that other devices can do better than this device. This is not a device that's going to do everything the best way. So just some quick examples of that. I still use the Supernote as my daily driver at work, and there are a number of aspects of that UI that makes it better for my use case than this particular device. This device can be an e-reader, but it hasn't quite shed enough weight where I think you would preferably read on this device versus an 8-inch device. So that trade-off, in my opinion, still makes e-reading better on a slightly smaller device that has more portability and less weight. So those are the type of examples that I mean. So, and there are certainly a lot of things that the device can improve upon, and I'll go through kind of a detailed list now of both the pros and the cons to kind of give you a sense of that. So it's not a perfect device by any stretch of the imagination. It's just really good across the board. And that's really my final verdict overall. But I want to go into detail. I want to paint a more nuanced picture of the device, and we're going to go ahead and do that now. And then after I go through those points, we'll come back together and kind of wrap things up. All right, let's start with the predominant pros of the device, and I'll start with snappy performance. Going through the device, going through the particular menus, turning on apps, downloading apps, all of this, is really nice and snappy and crisp. Is it the fastest device I've ever used? I'm not sure about that, but it's certainly among the fastest devices that I've ever used. So it's really good. You never feel like you're being bogged down. So that's really one of the main strengths of the device. Another strength, of course, is Kaleido 3 Color, and there's positive and negative aspects. We'll get to the negative aspects in a bit. But, having color in e-ink, I think is fantastic. There are limitations to Kaleido Color. It only has a little over 4,000 colors, for example. but how the technology has developed, how the software compensates for that limitation is really amazing. The color may not always be accurate, but I prefer it vastly to black and white screens. Your mileage might vary, but I certainly count this among one of the major benefits of this particular device. Apps, we did a whole video on how apps perform. You can check that video out and just see it firsthand for yourself. But pretty much all the major apps that I usually use or test worked really well on this device. There was no exceptions. Just everything was what you would hope it would be on an e-ink device. So just really great performance overall. And these things kind of encapsulate what I think stands out among the positives. There's more things that I want to highlight here, but these aren't necessarily specific to this device. These are more specific to the Boox ecosystem, if you will, but they certainly apply to this device as well. And we'll start with the note-taking app. Hands down, the Boox note-taking app is one of the most sophisticated in the industry. It's certainly the most feature-laden. Extremely powerful, and you can do more with this app than any other app out there. Now, one could argue whether it's the best note-taking app or not. That's a much more nuanced conversation, and I'll explore that a little bit in a future video as it relates to the Supernote. But nevertheless, objectively speaking, it's an incredible app, and it's one of the strengths of this device and of Boox in general. Kind of coupled with that is the handwriting to text feature. And yes, you can take handwriting and convert it to text, and yes, that works really well a lot of the time. But I think the killer application in the Boox note-taking app is the fact that you can search for handwriting when you're searching within notes or between notes, and it gets it right a large percentage of the time. So if I've got a 100-page notebook and somewhere in there I wrote Flipboard or whatever, I can go to the search bar and search for Flipboard, and there's a good chance that that search will pull that out from my handwriting. Of course, it's not perfect, as our handwriting isn't perfect, but it's actually one of the most amazing things about Boox and their technology. And this going back a couple of years now, and it continues to this device as well. The Reader app, a Neo Reader, is an amazing app. It handles a lot of different file formats. It has a lot of functionality to it. It has a lot of ways that you can tailor your reading experience within the app. There's just an incredible amount of complexity to the reading app. And again, not specific to the 3C, but certainly to all Boox devices, and that strength is here as well, along with Google Play. Google Play, is old news among Boox devices. Big Me Devices has Google Play as well. So again, not a unique feature, but it has to be called out because it just expands on the functionality of the device. So I'll give the easy but still powerful example. If you go off and you buy a Kindle, say a Scribe or a Paperwhite or what have you, you've got a great device, and you've got access to Amazon's library of ebooks, which is a fantastic library, right? But you can get that here because you can download the Kindle app, and you can download the Kobo app, and the Barnes & Noble app, and Google Books app, and Libby if you have your library. In other words, you have an e-reading functionality that is just so much more expanded because of this access to the Google Play Store. So again, not specific to this device, but it is part of the package, and it is incredible, even though it's certainly, we've had devices with Google Play for years now in the e-ink realm, still is important to call it out because it remains a major strength of the device. So focusing on the cons now, there's two that really stick out and need to be called out. And the first is related to ghosting. Now, it's true that ghosting is inherent in Kaleido 3 screens. You give me a device that has Kaleido 3, and I'll show you ghosting. However, the behavior of that ghosting does vary from device to device. And in this particular case, it's kind of strange. So on one hand, and kind of the good news, I suppose, the 3C does a really good job of muting the ghosting. So we saw that, I think, probably most explicitly when we were comparing the 3C versus the Tab Ultra C in my app performance video, and we were looking at comic books, and you could see how much more stark the ghosting was on the Tab Ultra C versus the 3C. So on one hand, the 3C does a good job in muting that ghosting. But on the other hand, I can't recall, and my memory may be failing me here, but I don't remember ghosting being as prevalent in a previous Kaleido 3 device as it is in this device. There's ghosting everywhere. There's ghosting in the UI. There's ghosting in the note-taking app. There's ghosting in any app that you download. I mean, it's everywhere you turn. And not, that's not totally unusual. It just seemed like a little more prevalent than what I'm used to. So clearly ghosting is an issue with this device. Now, how you feel about ghosting will vary based on your preferences. Some people literally think that the ghosting itself means Kaleido's a completely failed technology and it's a deal breaker. And then there's people on the other end of the spectrum, like myself, that I don't like the ghosting. I prefer the ghosting wasn't there, but it becomes white noise for me. Or if it really got bad, I can just do a swipe of the screen to refresh it and eliminate the ghosting. In other words, I can live with the ghosting. And that's where I stand on it, but there's no question that ghosting stands among the biggest cons for this particular device. The other one that's very notable, of course, is around battery life. Now, I wouldn't go as far to say that the battery life is bad, but I wouldn't call it good either. I think it's okay. The battery life is certainly acceptable. I understand the trade-off here. A bigger battery, which would have resulted in better battery life, would have added weight to the device, which I think would have ultimately been detrimental. So I agree with Boox's choice on having the size of the battery that they do. And I think that trade-off is worth it. But I still have to list this as a con because there's plenty of other devices out there with better battery life that are e-ink devices, even with Kaleido 3 screens. So this one does stand out. I don't consider this a deal breaker necessarily, but it has to be called out as a con. There's a lot of little things that I like about the 3C that I want to call out that are really nice, but you would never buy the device for these things. So I've moved them from the primary category to the secondary category because they're just things that are nice to have. And so, for example, I call it now the classic design. It was back in 2020 when the Note Air was first released, so it's almost 3 years old now. And, or I guess it is 3 years old at this point. And the design's aged very well. Interestingly enough, that original Note Air was released simultaneous to the Remarkable 2. And I think both devices are really excellent designs that have absolutely held up over time. I think the Remarkable 2 is a little bit better. I almost call that a piece of art, frankly. But the Note Air is no slouch either, and certainly very unusual for Boox. It tends to have, black slates as opposed to any type of sense of design. The Note Air bucks that trend. It has just the right touches with the orange lines, the thinness of the device. It's just a great design, and it hasn't gotten old, and it still continues to this day. The device is easy to hold because of the relative weight of the device, because the edges are kind of rounded. It's just a very easy device to hold on to. You can even hold on to it one-handed for certain periods of time. So just a nice physical device overall. The cover that comes with it, there's pros and cons to it. We'll get to the cons in just a second. But the pro is that it does certainly the job of protecting the device. It's a nice solid cover. And the stand for the cover is really fantastic. The design on that is pretty amazing. I don't know how often I'll use it in the design phase, so that's why it's not a primary pro. But one thing I do want to mention is that it grips. So when you have it in stand mode, it's not likely to shift on you, even when you're interacting with it. So that's how nice that part of the cover is. So that's worth calling out. When I first got the device and I was writing on it, I didn't know what to think about the scratchiness of the screen. But as time went on, I really learned to appreciate it, and I really like it, actually. So the film that they've put on the device that results in that when you're taking notes, I think it's great, and it lists it as one of my pros. Again, not a let's go buy the device, but it's a nice to have. The front lighting is really good. There's one small exception, which we'll get to in the cons, but it is one of the strengths of the device, and it's not something that can be taken for granted. You know, recent devices like the Tab Mini C, for example, have had a little bit of issues with front lighting. In that device in particular, it's a little bit what we call dirty on top, where the lighting isn't as uniform, and so it has some dark spots and spaces on it. It's not a deal breaker for that device, but it's not something that you'd want to see. Here, I think, again, with one exception, the lighting is really well done, and something I appreciate on the device. The speakers are decent. I do want to super caveat this, that they're decent for a device like this. These are not speakers that you would be like, oh, I want to play some music on it or whatever. But they serve their purpose, and I think they do a pretty good job. And then finally, they're the stylus. And I'm probably, not everyone agrees for sure. Maybe I'm even in the minority. But I've always liked the Boox stylus with the grooves along the side. And that's the same stylus that was released with the original Note Air. I think it's a great stylus. And I count it among the pros. Again, not something you'd buy the device for just because it's there, but I appreciate that it's there. All right, so let's kind of wrap up with looking at some of the minor cons about the 3C. And these are all things that, they shouldn't dissuade you from buying the device, but you're aware that these, or I'm at least aware that these things are there. And it would be great if these things were kind of improved in future iterations. So we'll start with the device itself and the weight. It weighed in at about 14 grams, heavier than indicated. So that was a disappointment. And it's more than just an issue in the sense that they said it was one number and it turned out to be another. That actual additional weight has an impact. So the amount of time that you can hold the device one-handed is a little bit less because of that additional weight. And the reason why one-handed holding is important, at least to me, is that I like to do my e-reading with one hand. So the advantages of that is that I can hold the device at a higher level, so I don't necessarily have to look down. And also I can grab a drink, like a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, and drink while I'm reading the book one-handed. Now you can certainly use this device one-handed, but that weight does eventually build up. Had that weight been more as advertised, or maybe even a little bit better, then you could hold the device in one hand for longer periods of time. So I do consider that to be a minor con. Now I mentioned that lighting overall was really good, but there was one exception, and this is a curious one. And initially I didn't think it was a problem with front lighting. I thought it was a problem inherent in the screen. But after using the device for a while, it became apparent that it was specific to the lighting. But there's this bar on the very left side, a very well-defined bar, that is slightly grayer than the rest of the screen when front lighting is on. And I guess that's an artifact of the front lighting itself. It's kind of annoying that it's there. It's not a functional problem at all, but it's just a thing that you kind of wish wasn't there, even though it doesn't create any particular problems, but you certainly see it and you're aware of it. As much as I like the cover in terms of the build of it and the stand in particular, it's not a premium cover by any stretch. It's not the same material used with the Tab Mini C. That cover feels very premium. When you feel it, it actually enhances the device. It's that good in my opinion. And that's not the case here. The cover is much more plasticky, and that's not a huge detraction, but it's a little disappointing in light of what Boox was able to do with the Mini C cover. Perhaps it needed to be that way because of all the folding, that they had to use different materials. I don't know, but that's just something that I wanted to call out. And in a kind of similar vein, there is this issue, and this is a combination of the cover, but it's more, I think, a problem with the fact that, remember that the 3C has these curved sides, so it's not a flat side. And so the side that you stick the stylus on magnetically, it can be a little weak and prone to rolling over. And how that manifests itself in actual use is that at my desk, I have the device to my right. That's where I've got room to put the desk and leave it on the table. So when I reach over and grab it from the side, the pen, oftentimes, if I'm not careful how I grab it, will roll over onto the top of the screen. So very weird, not a huge deal, but not a great feature. I can't recall a device that did that before, so that's very unique to this particular device. This is a complaint that is not unique to this device. It's unique to the note-taking app, which, again, I generally mention is one of the best in the industry. But it perplexes me that there's no formal highlighting function in that app. There is a marker that kind of functions as a highlighter, but not quite. When you use it, it kind of creates an effect that I don't think is particularly... It's fine, but it's not great. And this really comes up more as a con because other companies, particularly BigMe, has a highlighter option in their Notes app, which is fantastic. And so it seems like if BigMe can do it, then Boox can do it. And so I see this as a con. And I actually like to use the highlighter. I like to create to-do lists, and then I use the highlighter to mark them off. And that's one of the areas where kind of color shines, actually, in e-ink. And so not to have that feature is a very small thing, but it's something I'd notice. So I talked about how great the reading app was in terms of, the different file types that it can handle and that sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is that the UI on it is super complicated. You've got menus, multiple menus that you can get to. There's a huge learning curve. You could argue some of those same things are true of the Notes app, but I feel like the Notes app has a much more linear, kind of, easier to engage UI than the reading app. The reading app UI to me is not well thought out. It's not streamlined, and there's a lot of work I think Boox needs to do there to make it kind of easier to work with. Of course, you can just play with it, you can get to know it, and it's fine. But I think Boox could have done more to kind of lessen that learning curve by not making it as quite the mess that it is. And again, that's not specific to the device, that's specific to the Neo Reader across many Boox devices. I really like the new AI eraser function, but I feel like it's not quite fully baked. Another feature that is analogous to this is the lasso tool. So in a video I showed, I think this was in the UI video, the visual tour rather, is that you can either do the traditional lasso where you literally decide what you want within the lasso by circling it, or you can go to a smart lasso where the AI, and I use that term loosely in this case, will identify not just the literal area that you drew, but what did you mean to include. It kind of expands based on what you draw. So for example, if I wrote the word better, and using the classic lasso tool, and I drew right through the middle of that word, it would cut off the word. The lasso wouldn't include the piece that I'd circled around. But with Smart Lasso, if I cut through the middle of the word better, it will include the whole word. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because the AI function functions more like the traditional lasso, where you scribble and it, for the most part, only eliminates what you literally scribble. So the result of that is if you write something out and you use that tool, there's artifacts that end up being left behind. What I would like to see in a future iteration is going to a smart eraser tool function where it understands that your scribble is meaning an area and that it erases accordingly. And so until they do that, I kind of feel like this functionality isn't quite what it should be. Not a huge con, but certainly a minor one. And this last bullet, I was somewhat hesitant to even mention this. I've only had the device freeze on me twice, and both of those actually were captured on the video of the virtual tour, oddly enough. And one time was when the system UI, and the other time was actually probably an issue in loading Google Play for the first time. Since that video, I haven't had any freezing issues, so I'm kind of torn on whether to include this. I have seen other people make posts talking about freezing, and I did have those two experiences, so I kind of put that here, but just know I was really on the borderline about whether I mentioned this or not, because it's been flawless since that original video. So one thing I want to point out, and when this device was announced, I had high hopes for this device. I thought that maybe this could be the one device that rules them all. And what I meant by that is this could be a daily driver at work. This could be your preferred e-reader, despite its size, because it was just light enough to do that, and all the other things that it can do well. And it really it makes a challenge for that claim of the one to rule them all. It just doesn't quite get there. And so I think initially, interestingly, I had these massive expectations, and my first feelings of the device were actually disappointment. And that's really more of a product of my expectations than it was the device itself. But I mention that because I do think that it sets the right context for the device, which is it's not going to blow you away necessarily, but it's going to do a lot of things really well. And I think that kind of encapsulates where this device stands. Isn't going to be the perfect at everything, but it's going to do everything at more than acceptable performance levels. And that's kind of my feelings overall. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions about any of the things I talked about, or maybe points I missed, please put those in the comments. I'm not done doing videos on the 3C, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video. There's some requests people have had about, things like, how does Space Desk work on the device, or how does this work with a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse? So I'm going to explore those things, but to me, those are more tangential to the main experience of the device, and that's why I felt like doing this review at this time. But certainly more to come. And so please subscribe, because we do have more content on this device. And I think you'll find it interesting, if not particularly helpful. So thank you as always, and I'll see you next time.